হরিনামধারং করো জপ্যকারং হরিনাম পরং নয়নে সততং প্রণয়াশ্রুধরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং। সততং জনত ভব তাপহরং পরমার্থপরায়ণ লোকগতিং নবলেহকরং জগতাপহরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং। ভক্তিকারং প্রিয় চারুতারং নট নর্তন নাগর রাজকুলং কুলকামিনী মানস লাস্যকরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং। করতাল বলং কলকণ্ঠবরং মৃদুবাদ সুবীনকয়া মধুরং নিজ ভক্তি গুণাবৃত নাট্যকরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং। ধর্মযুতাং পুনঃ নন্দসুতাং ধরণী সুচিত্রাং ভবভাবচিতাং তনুধ্যানচিতাং নিজ বাসযুতাং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং প্রণমামি সচিসুত গৌরবরং। सचीसुत गौरवरं प्रणमामि 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 सचीसुत गौरवरं।
सची दुलाला नाचत श्री हरि कीर्तन में। शीरे चूरा दरसी वाले शीरे चूरा दरसी वाले बन फूल माला हिया पर डोले। बन फूल माला हिया पर डोले। पहिरन पीत पटांबर सोहे। पहिरन पीत पटांबर सोहे। नूपुर रुनु झुनु चरणों में। नूपुर रुनु झुनु चरणों में। सुंदर लाला सची दुलाला नाचत श्री हरि कीर्तन में। सुंदर लाला सची दुलाला नाचत श्री हरि कीर्तन में। राधा कृष्णा एक तनु है। राधा कृष्णा एक तनु है। राधा कृष्णा एक तनु है। निधुवन माझे बंसी बजाए। निधुवन माझे बंसी बजाए। विश्वरूप की प्रभु जी सही। विश्वरूप की प्रभु जी सही। आवत प्रकट ही नदिया में। आवत प्रकट ही नदिया में। लाला सची दुलाला नाचत श्री हरि कीर्तन में। कोई गावत है राधा कृष्ण नाम, कोई गावत है राधा कृष्ण नाम। कोई गावत है हरि गुण गान, कोई गावत है हरि गुण गान। मंगलतान मृदंग रसाला, मंगलतान मृदंग रसाला। बाजत है कोई रंगन में, बाजत है कोई रंगन में। सुंदर लाला सची दुला नाचत श्री हरि कीर्तन में। सुंदर लाला सची दुलाला नाचत है हरि कीर्तन में। सुंदर लाला सची दुलाला नाचत श्री हरि कीर्तन में। Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna Mataji, please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna. So we are very fortunate today to have association of Her Grace Visakha Mataji. Like yesterday we were talking, His Grace Yadubhar Prabhu was there to give his association, and we heard about Mataji also yesterday, that how she came in Krishna consciousness through Prabhu, and Prabhu narrated the pastime when they went for a they were on a trekking at 10,000 feet at the slow line, and there Prabhu introduced Bhagavad Gita to Mataji. So we are very fortunate to have association of Mataji, and there are a lot of pastimes that we request Mataji to share during the session. I will just mention one point about that I could not able to mention yesterday, that they worked, both of them, Mataji and Prabhu, they worked together for producing many documentaries, and one of them was which was released in 2017, Hare Krishna, the mantra, the movement, and the Swami who started it all. And That documentary won the jury prize for best picture at 2017 Illuminate Film Festival in Sedona, Arizona, and has enjoyed well-attended screenings in the theaters throughout the United States, Canada, India, Mauritius, South America, and South Africa. So we are very fortunate to have both of their association. Yesterday we had Prabhu's association and today. So we will by chanting one time Hare Krishna Mahamani. Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Rama Hare Rama, Rama Rama Hare Hare.
We're good now?
Hare Krishna Mataji.
I start now? Now is time?
Yeah, Mataji, you can start. Your voice is little less. You can.
You can hear me okay?
It's not that much loud.
Is that better?
Just a minute, I will see. It's
Ram Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharane Nirvase Susunyavadi Pasyata Deshatarane Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha, Kripa Sindhu Vyevacha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna. Can you hear me all right? Is the volume all right?
yes, Mataji. Now it's okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you. I feel very honored to be in your company, and I feel very deeply for your great loss. This exalted personality, Bhakti Charu Swami. It was terrible for you, of course, as his disciples, and for the entire society. It was an enormously painful passing. So my heart goes out to you, my heartfelt condolences, and wishes for your spiritual strength at this very difficult time. It was really sudden. With Srila Prabhupada's passing, we had some months, although we didn't really believe that he would leave us. Nonetheless, we did have some months where we saw that his health was declining. His eating became less and less, and his strength also became less and less. So it became clear, looking back on it all, though at the time, at least I didn't accept that it was going to happen. But with Bhakti Charu Swami, it was very sudden. And I was always thinking that he would recover. So from that point of view, it was a great shock. So now so many of us have been in this position of terrible loss. Prabhupada disciples, the disciples of Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, the disciples of Tamal Krishna Maharaj, and now your good selves. So it's very important to know how to deal with this grief, this intense grief, and to get spiritual strength from each other as best we can, so that we can go on and please our spiritual master, doing what they would want us to do. They really don't want us to shrivel up, to become discouraged, to become frail spiritually. They want to see us strong and enthusiastic and confident. So by getting together in this way, associating with each other, we can grow in our enthusiasm and our confidence, and also in our patience. It's very important elements in spiritual life. So Parshuram Prabhu gave me some questions to address. The first one he mentioned was how I came to Krishna consciousness. Probably yesterday from my husband, Yadavar Prabhu, you heard some of the story. I was born and raised in an atheistic family. Both my parents came from traditional religions, my mother from the Roman Catholic Church and my father from the Jewish tradition. And as they grew up, they felt that there was so many rituals that didn't really have any significance. It was just empty rituals. And they were not inspired by these. And so separately, before they even met, they gave up religion. So they raised my brother and me as atheists the whole 20 years of my life. I didn't go into a church or a temple or a synagogue or any sort of religious institution. And I really wasn't interested in spiritual life. I felt it really didn't have validity. I couldn't see it, I couldn't touch it, I couldn't taste it. It was non-existent in my mind. So when I went to India, it was at the invitation of Yadavar. He decided to do his master's thesis on the Hare Krishna people. For that purpose, he went to India in 1970. And from India, he wrote to me and he suggested that I join him there. So I did that in March. I arrived in March of 71. And that was the time that just before the very first pandal that the devotees organized in Mumbai. And because I was in Bombay with the devotees, I attended that pandal. And we found out many years later that Radhanath Swami was also there and was also very impacted by it, as I was. And it was extraordinary to see the incredible piety and appreciation that the people of India had for Srila Prabhupada, that he had gone in such a pioneering, heroic way by himself with no funding, no support, left the country, India, for the first time, and was able to gather foreign disciples, American and European disciples. And he brought them, 30 or 40, to India. And there they were on the stage in Mumbai, chanting the holy names of the Lord that we learned from the Vedic scriptures. These are not Western names. Wearing traditional garb, the sari, the dhoti, with the tufts of hair, the sikha, and the people of India were just astounded by this. And they would come, there would be 10,000 people there to be with the devotees and hear them chanting and hear Prabhupada's discourse. So I was there on the stage because, as far as I knew, I was the only, if I was in the audience, I was practically the only Westerner. So I was there on the stage with them, although I was not a disciple by any means, and I didn't know anything about Krishna consciousness, neither was I particularly interested in the philosophy. But just circumstantially, there I was. And I was just marveling at the piety of the people of India and how they revered Srila Prabhupada and offered him so much respect and honor for who he was and what he had done, both. And this impacted me. And then, as you heard later on, John, my then friend who became Yadavar, he gave me the Bhagavad Gita to read. And although I love to read, I really could not understand this book. I could not make head nor tail of it. It was very confusing to me. This was the abridged version prior to the Macmillan version in 1972. But at the same time, just being with the book and trying to understand it, I had a sense that this book could offer me something very valuable, something that could give meaning to my life and fill the emptiness that I was feeling inside. I was becoming quite accomplished in my field of photography, but I felt I had a vacuum inside that I could not identify. And this book connected with me in such a way that I thought this could give me values and direction that would really be beneficial to me. So it was a bit of a mystical experience, reading Bhagavad Gita for the first time. Later on, we went to Vrindavan after that. Prabhupada had actually instructed us to go there. Did Yadavar tell you that story of how we wound up in Vrindavan? Yes, no? Is anyone unmuted?
You can narrate, Mataji.
Did he tell you yesterday? I don't want to repeat it.
He shared some pastimes, but it was not specific to your pastimes. Maybe you can. He told 2-3 pastimes that you are supposed to narrate today.
Oh, unfortunately, I was busy when he spoke, so I was not able to hear him. I wanted to. But what happened was that after the Bombay Pandal, Yadabar and I decided that we wanted to do a photographic essay of a quaint Indian village. We thought that a magazine like National Geographic, which is a very popular magazine, would be interested, or their readership would be interested to see how these villagers in this quaint Indian village, they live without machinery. They depend on the grace of nature, on the animals, the cow and the bull. They can harvest by hand and husk the rice by hand. They can make cotton from their own looms. They can have dramas under the night sky. And we thought this would be fascinating for a Western audience. But the problem that we had was we did not know which Indian village would be most suitable for this purpose. We were both new to India. So we thought, well, Srila Prabhupada has traveled throughout India. We'll explain the idea to him and ask him which village we should go to. So after the Pandal in Bombay, we went to Prabhupada in his room in Akashganga. The temple was on the 7th floor of this high-rise in Bombay. And we explained to him our idea that we were very enamored by. And Prabhupada looked at us, and his look had a mixture of gravity and amusement. And he said to us gravely, "You do not speak the language. Wherever you go, they will simply cheat you and steal your cameras." So it was like a bubble had popped for us. We had this great idea. And Prabhupada was saying it's completely impractical, forget about it. But then Prabhupada paused just the right length of time. And he looked at us and he said, "Best that you go to Vrindavan and you do your photographic story in Vrindavan." So this was in March, April. It was very hot at that time, especially for us coming from the West. So first we went to Nepal, and we trekked in Nepal, which is where I read Bhagavad Gita. And then after that, we went to Vrindavan. So by now it was July, August. It was still hot, but perhaps not as hot. And we spent a month in Vrindavan, and that month truly transformed me because I didn't speak enough Hindi that people could preach to me. But I would wander the streets of Vrindavan with my camera. And there was just faith, deep, rich faith everywhere. Everywhere you're greeted by Jai Radhe, everywhere there are temple bells ringing, people worshiping, chanting constantly, and doing devotional service all day. So to be in that environment for a month really changed my heart. That was somehow or other, that was the first instruction that Srila Prabhupada gave me. And there could not have been a better instruction for me coming from my background. So after a month, Gurdas and Jamuna came through Vrindavan, and Gurdas said, "We want to make a Vyasa Puja book to honor Srila Prabhupada just from the devotees in India, his disciples in India. So we're going to do this in Calcutta. So you please come to Calcutta." He knew that we had some background in printing. So I really didn't want to leave Vrindavan. It was before Janmashtami, and already all these very exotic looking devotees were coming to Vrindavan for Janmashtami. But Yadabar convinced me to go. He said we could come back some other time. So we went to Calcutta, and Calcutta was quite an experience for me. This was the time of the war between India and Pakistan, the Bangladesh war. And because of this war, there were 1 million refugees who came from Bangladesh and settled in Calcutta. And so every street was lined with these refugees. They brought whatever they could bring with them, their pots, their clothes, And there they were. Their home was on the sidewalks throughout the city. It was unbelievable. I thought Mumbai was crowded, but Mumbai was not at all crowded when you compared it to Calcutta. So the whole city was under stress from this influx of refugees who had left their homes, left their properties. They, just came with what they could carry. And that kind of overwhelming nature, the tension infiltrated into the Calcutta temple, which meant that the devotees were having a very difficult time. Some of them were getting sick. They couldn't function in an Indian kitchen. So they hired somebody who they thought was a Brahmin cook. And it turned out that he was neither a cook nor a Brahmin. So what they called prasadam was very much inferior. And the devotees got weak. And as a result of all of this, they were arguing. The devotees were arguing with each other. And there I was, brand new in this environment. And all I could think of is that, spiritual life is interesting by this point. And Prabhupada is a wonderful gentleman, but I have a life to lead. I don't need to be in a place that's so dysfunctional. So I was actually planning to go back to college. And I started filling out my application. I had done 2 years and gotten a degree, and there were 2 years left to get the full degree. So I thought I'll go and finish my college education. And there was one young disciple of Srila Prabhupada there, Chitralekha, and she understood my mentality and what I was planning. And she said, you can't leave now because Srila Prabhupada is coming. So that's what kept me hanging by a very frayed thread in the Calcutta temple. Not the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, but the mantra was, you can't leave now because Srila Prabhupada is coming. And Prabhupada did come. He came in October. And we were watching him. The temple in Calcutta is still the temple that's there today. There's a balcony. You can overlook the street below. And Prabhupada got out of his car and he was so regal looking and so present and so observant, so aware of his surroundings. So he came up the stairs. It was the British style. So at that time, they had very wide wooden staircases, quite regal, quite suited for Srila Prabhupada. And he offered his obeisances to Radha Govinda, the worshipable deities in the Calcutta temple. And he looked at the small paintings we had on the walls, and then he sat on the Vyasasana and looked at us. And we were quite a bedraggled crew in the Calcutta temple. And he spoke some words of appreciation for the Vyasa Puja book that we had put together, and also for our efforts there, just being in the Calcutta temple and trying our best to maintain it for his pleasure. And then he said, we're going to have an Istagosti tomorrow morning. And he wanted everybody there. So he picked a time after breakfast where the pujaris were also free and they could come and attend. And we all gathered in his room. And this is the same room that you'll see today in the Calcutta temple on 3 Albert Road. So we gathered and Prabhupada looked around. He noticed that one of the ladies wasn't there, it was missing. So he sent one of the gentlemen to find her. We all waited. He wanted everyone to be present for this Istagosti. And finally, when she came, then he began to speak. And he spoke the very simple, beautiful philosophy that even I, as a new person, had already heard. Just that we're not beings of this material world. This material world is full of problems. It's full of suffering. And it's never going to stop being full of problems and full of suffering. But we have a higher goal. We have a goal to come closer to Krishna, to try to please him and reach him. And we should focus on this goal and understand that this material world is meant to give us impetus to go towards that goal. And this way he spoke the very simple philosophy. And then he turned to his own example, and that is Tagosti, about how he had to tolerate. Now, we all know the story of Srila Prabhupada and how much he went through to bring Krishna consciousness to the English-speaking people of the world. How he had to struggle to print the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam with no money and no support to speak of, and how he had to struggle to get all the paperwork together so that he could leave India with the Bhagavatams, and how he had to convince Srimati Maraji to give him passage on the Jaladuta. And then once on the Jaladuta, this terrible, terrible heart attacks that he suffered, 2 of them. If a third one came, surely, he said, I would have died. And then it wasn't over in New York. Again, there's no support. He's trying to sell his books. He's trying to interest people in his message. And then his valuables are stolen. The typewriter, the tape recorder, stolen. And he thinks that it was somebody who was supposed to be guarding the place, the superintendent. So in this way, there were so many things at that Calcutta Istagosti that he could have pointed to as his own personal austerities that he had to tolerate. But what he said was, I had to share a refrigerator with someone who was keeping meat in it. At some point, there was cat food in the refrigerator where Prabhupada was keeping his boga. And this to him was, from his caliber of a pure Vaishnava, this is just a terrible austerity. So that's what he brought out during this Calcutta Istagosti. And it struck me, this person of such a high standing spiritual life, having to do this, share a refrigerator where there's meat for the cat. What a horrible thing. And yet he put up with all of this. And he was encouraging us to also tolerate the austerities in Calcutta Hare Krishna temple, because this would be pleasing to Krishna and pleasing to Srila Prabhupada. And so when I had walked into Prabhupada's room to sit down to attend that Istagosti, I had felt like Atlas. Atlas is holding the whole world on his shoulders. He's bending over from the weight of it, the burden. And after I heard Srila Prabhupada speak in that way, when I left his room, it was like I wasn't even touching the ground. So it was the first time that I experienced the potency of Srila Prabhupada's words and how they could uplift my consciousness and give me strength that I didn't know I had and tolerance that I didn't know I had. So this was a very profound experience. And as the very next month, I got initiated because of this, largely because of staying in Vrindavan for this month and then hearing from Srila Prabhupada. And also I must say that because he presented spiritual life so logically, that it was very appealing to me. And it became much more logical than the so-called scientific explanations for the existence of the planet and the varieties of species of life and the human form. All that explanation, which I had accepted before, made less and less sense. It really crumbled. When you think of the incredible diversity of the interaction of all the different species and how they're complementary to each other, that complexity coming out of nothing or coming out of an explosion, it was crazy. I saw it as crazy after hearing from Prabhupada for some time and having these other experiences. So those were some of my interactions with Srila Prabhupada. And because I had studied photography in college, that was my major, as it was Yadavar Prabhu. That's where we met as photography majors. We naturally started photographing Srila Prabhupada, and Yadavar started filming him. And that became our primary service after a few years, to be Prabhupada's photographer and filmmaker. And we're very grateful we had that opportunity by dint of what we were interested in and specializing in. because it gave us a chance to be with Srila Prabhupada. So at every opportunity, I would go on his walks, I'd be present for his darshans, and travel with him. I traveled with him in the USA and in Europe. We were able to be present for the installation of Radha Gokulananda at Bhaktivedanta Manor, and also Radha Paris Ishwaram in Paris. We could film and photograph these, and yeah, that was quite extraordinary. And of course, once in a while there would be interactions, and we would have some personal exchange with Prabhupada. Although largely I was there as a photojournalist. And a photojournalist, that's our training, is that we don't interfere with what we're taking pictures of. We try to record it as it is. And anyway, I tend to be quiet anyway. And very often Prabhupada was surrounded by his leaders, and they would be having discussions. So I didn't say much generally when I was with Prabhupada. There were some exceptions, but generally I didn't say much. There was one time in Vrindavan, we were on a morning walk down Bhakti Swami Maharaj. And when Prabhupada started the walk, he looked at the moon. And from the shape of the moon, he could tell that tomorrow was Ekadasi, which I've tried to do that since then. I find it very difficult because the changes in the moon's shape are so gradual and subtle. But Prabhupada said, no, tomorrow is Ekadasi. He could see from the moon. And the conversation became about the moon on that morning walk. And Prabhupada explained that within the moon, there's some fire and it's covered by ice. And because of that icy covering, the light from the moon, when it reaches us, it's cooling, which is fascinating. And I had been reading Bhagavad Gita regularly. So this particular morning walk, I don't know, I piped up and I said to Srila Prabhupada, amongst all these, there must have been, I don't know, 20 young men with him. And I said, in Bhagavad Gita, you write that the moonlight gives nourishment to vegetables. It makes them succulent. So how is that? And I expected some kind of answer like photosynthesis. You know, the sunlight hits the leaf and then oxygen is released and carbon, you know, all that carbon dioxide is taken out of the air and this and that. Something like that. That's what, you know, vaguely I was thinking. So I asked this question, and to my surprise and a little bit dismay, Prabhupada stopped walking. And he put his cane down and he looked right in my eyes. And of course, all the men stopped walking. So I had about, I don't know, 40 eyes on me. And he said, Prabhupada said, why don't you ask him? And I didn't know what to say. You know, why don't I ask the moon? Yeah, no, I was just speechless. I was so speechless that they all started walking. And I was still standing there for another second or two. And then I had to run a bit to catch up. So Prabhupada's answers to questions were always 10% Krishna conscious, but you could never know how he would answer them. And sometimes, according to circumstance, he would answer the same question in a different way to different people or a different time, which was very interesting also to hear how he did that. Also, I was reading, before we were supposed to get to questions pretty soon. So I wanted to mention that Prabhupada gave a fascinating talk in Los Angeles on the occasion of the disappearance of his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And in that talk, he brought in two words, which are very significant. Prakat, which means manifest, and aprakat, which means unmanifest. And he compared it to the sun, just like where you are now. I think it's early morning, the sun has risen. No, not yet? Oh, it's night. Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, that's a good example. So for you, the sun is aprakat. It's not manifest. For me, it's like 3:30, 3:45. So the sun is very bright. So it's prakat, it's manifest. But when the sun sets here, right, in a few hours, 5 or 6 hours, and it becomes aprakat, it doesn't mean that it's not existing. It simply means that I cannot see it. It's not manifest to my eyes. But soon it will be manifest to your eyes. Yeah, when morning comes, it will be manifest to your eyes. So he said, similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he was in Vrindavan doing his very sweet pastimes with the gopis, with his mother and his friends, his father. And that was prakat, that was manifest. But today he is still in Vrindavan, but aprakat. He's not manifest in the ordinary way. It takes a spiritually empowered person to experience his presence. And Prabhupada said similarly, the jiva never actually is gone. We're eternal. As jivas, we're eternal, all of us. And the spiritual master, when he's present, that's prakat. He's giving you instructions or having exchanges with him. And you're growing from his experiences, from his association. And then there becomes a time when he's aprakat. The Prabhupada said, but he's still present. This is the point, he's still present. We have to become qualified to experience his presence. And it's so extraordinary how Prabhupada said he never felt himself to be apart from his spiritual master. He gave this talk 30 or 40 years after his spiritual master had departed. And yet he never felt himself apart from his spiritual master. And this is something that all of us here, as disciples of Srila Prabhupada, as disciples of Bhakti Charu Swami, this is something we should try to think about very deeply. How can we experience the presence of our spiritual master? Now we can look to Srila Prabhupada for the example of how to do that. Because by his example, we see that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had a driving desire to give Krishna consciousness to the English-speaking people of the world. And he expressed this to Prabhupada the first seconds that he met Prabhupada. We are familiar with that story. And that became Srila Prabhupada's driving desire. This is what my spiritual master wants. Let me plan how to do that. And by that unification of desire, that there was nothing in his mind except fulfilling this desire of his spiritual master somehow or other. He feels the presence of his spiritual master in his life. This is something that is pertinent to all of us and important to all of us. That if we want to feel the spiritual master's presence, see his mood, see what he wants of us, and really devote ourselves to that, and then he will grace us by his presence, and we'll have his mercy by his presence. I don't know if there's any questions. I found the transcript of this lecture. If there's no questions, I could read part of this lecture that Prabhupada gave. It was in December of 1973 in Los Angeles.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Mataji. No questions. So would you like to share?
Yeah.
More?
Prabhupada says,
Yeah, there is one question. Prema Avatar Prabhu, he is asking, can you please share the Jagannath pastime? He is asking, can you please share the Jagannath pastime? Yesterday, His Grace Jadubar Prabhu mentioned, but he didn't narrate it. Your aspiring servant, Prema Avatar Das.
okay, sure. Well, I could share my screen. I do have that photograph here. Actually, what we could do, I could do some photographs by the screen share. Can you see that?
Yes, Mataji.
Okay, this is San Francisco Rath Yatra, 1974. It was a glorious day. Prabhupada went to Golden Gate Park with all the devotees and Jagannath. And there were many, many people in Golden Gate Park to celebrate Rath Yatra with us. And at first I tried to go on the stage to be with all the devotees on the stage to photograph. But there was someone at the top of the stage who said, no women are allowed on the stage. And I tried to explain to this person that Prabhupada paid for my ticket to be there, Prabhupada paid for my camera and film, I was authorized by the BBT, I was traveling with Prabhupada just for the purpose of photographing. But he was adamant. He said, no women are allowed on the stage. So I became discouraged because I thought the first teaching of Krishna in Bhagavad Gita is that we're not the body. I'm just trying to do my service for Srila Prabhupada, and this person stopping me and so on and so forth. The mind really took off. So I went to the back of the field and sat down in an empty chair there with my head down and my camera dangling. And then I heard the kirtan on the stage pick up. So I looked up and Prabhupada had gotten up from his Vyasasana and he had a bunch of roses and he was throwing them one by one to the crowd. And then he took the balance of the bunch of roses and threw that to the crowd. And then he put both his arms up, as you see here, and he started to dance. So I stood up on the chair that I had been sitting on, took a series of pictures. This is one of them. You can see, this is my husband's camera. He was on the stage. He got some wonderful footage. But this perspective was unique. Actually, if I had planned it in advance, I could not have gotten a better perspective. So you can see the hands in the front, joining Prabhupada in his ecstasy. And so it was a lesson for me to see it as Krishna's arrangement. I was trying to think later on who that person was who had stopped me from going on the stage. And I couldn't think. We all knew each other at that time. The society was quite small. But I couldn't think who it was. I couldn't even think if he was wearing white or saffron. So that way it became a very mystical experience. And I was grateful for it, I must say. We can show some other photographs, yes. This is Prabhupada in the Akash Ganga building in Bombay. It was wonderful. Jamuna Devi Dasi, my god sister, she pointed out that whether Prabhupada was in front of a crowd of 10,000, 20,000, or whether he was alone in the room, he was the same. He was meditating on Krishna, serving Krishna in different ways. This is Golden Avatar Studios in Los Angeles. Prabhupada is singing one of the bhajans. Very often he would say that Mridanga was either too fast or too loud. In fact, there's a famous Jayarada Madhava tape. Prabhupada is playing the kartals before he starts singing. And it seems that he's addressing the Mridanga player and he says, sound. The devotees tended to play more loudly than Prabhupada wanted to. And a few times my husband and I were able to film Srila Prabhupada in the early morning hours. He's translating the Srimad Bhagavatam, Sanskrit to English. There was very intense concentration while he did this with his dictaphone. You can see that the sun has not even approached the horizon. It's very bright. San Diego Festival. This is in Michigan. wonderful temple that Ambarish Prabhu and Rika Shrivanti got on behalf of Srila Prabhupada's pleasure. And this is the moment in Prabhupada's room. This is Ambarish Prabhu here, Rika Shrivanti here. They're responsible for acquiring this wonderful building for Prabhupada. And this is the moment that Prabhupada suggests to Ambarish Prabhu that he can build the TOVP in Mayapur. Prabhupada asked him what he thought of the idea. He said, yes, sounds like a very good idea. Prabhupada said, then you can do what in Mayapur. So this is quite a historic moment in the history of our movement. New York City, we got this 11-story building for some time, 55th Street. And in this center in Potomac, Prabhupada asked his Bhaktivedanta Institute devotees to come and meet him there. And you can see them here. This is a famous Sadhaputta Prabhu, a brilliant scientist who really applied himself to understand Krishna consciousness and how it is coherent with scientific understandings. And this is Bhakti Charu Maharaj, Rupanuga Prabhu, and Nanda. These are all members of the Bhaktivedanta Institute. That was so important to Srila Prabhupada because he wanted to convince these so-called scientists that Krishna consciousness has a very solid scientific basis. Prabhupada was in Washington, D.C., and the Pujari from Baltimore, which is nearby Washington, D.C., sent him photographs of the Glorification deities in Baltimore. And Prabhupada said, let us go. So they drove there so that Prabhupada could take darshan of Here he borrowed one of his sannyasi disciples, Danda, posed for this picture. But most of his disciples were taller than he is. This Danda is supposed to be proportionate to the sannyasi's height. So you can see the Danda is taller than Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada was visiting the Amritala temple in Vrindavan. One of the devotees in that temple gave him this little booklet. He was quite interested to see the contents in that booklet. He was overall pleased by it. We, as my husband spoke yesterday, we were going to do the very first film for the movement. It became a film called the Hare Krishna People. For the beginning of this film, we wanted to show Srila Prabhupada's childhood Rath Yatra. So when we were in Dallas, we asked Prabhupada to please describe to us what his Rath Yatra card looked like. And Prabhupada asked for a piece of paper. I tore one out of my notebook. And he drew on this piece of paper his childhood Rath Yatra card. So we gave that to the archives. This is what he drew. And a little horse and a driver. Horse a place for the deities. It's quite charming. Let's see. Prabhupada was very much interested in developing farm communities, the first one being New Vrindavan. Spent time in New Vrindavan to encourage the devotees and direct them how to develop this community. Just as Bhakti Charu Swami was doing in his place in Florida, Orlando. Prabhupada also wanted the devotees to feel satisfied living this simple life in the country. Gave instructions to his servant, Pendra, to cook using his cooker. We hadn't seen this type of cooker before in the West. It's 3 tiers. So it took some instruction for us. Prabhupada was very used to it. He could cook a meal with very little time, full meal. He was very ingenious cooker. In the afternoons in Vrindavan, he would sit in his vyasasana and meet with the devotees. At one point in the afternoon, it was chilly, and he looked at one of the young ladies and he said, "Where is your cheddar?" And then he looked at the temple president and said, "You should ask the devotees what they need, especially the women. They may not come to you and tell you what they need, but you should ask them and provide for them." And because of this exchange, the young woman that he asked, whose name was Gopi, she is still in Vrindavan to this day. She opened a second-hand store there, so that any devotee who needs anything can go to the store and get it expensively. Clothes, any kinds of conveniences for their homes. Morning walk in Vrindavan. At this time they were building the Prabhupada Palace of Gold, and the devotees were just learning how to do the stained glass, all sorts of other work, marble work and so forth for this construction. Prabhupada examined it while he was there. We also saw the first cow, ISKCON's first cow. I was very pleased about that. This is one of the very few pictures of Bhakti Swami with Srila Prabhupada. This is Bhakti Swami holding the plate. Prabhupada also went to Gita Nagari. These pictures were taken by Yadava. He was encouraging the devotees. This is their very advanced machinery for keeping the milk cool so it didn't spoil. Prabhupada looked at what they were growing on the property. Again, we're in the Akash Ganga building. And his morning walks in Juhu. This is the famous Dr. Patel, who would join us every morning. And he and Prabhupada would sometimes have very strong disagreements about the philosophy, to the point where some devotees would get upset with Dr. Patel for speaking to Prabhupada in a way that they felt was not respectful. This would go on morning after morning after morning. Dr. Patel identified himself as a Vaishnava, but in his discussions with Srila Prabhupada, it became apparent that he was influenced by Mayavad philosophy, which is why they would have these heated disagreements. And every time Prabhupada came to Juhu, which would go on for perhaps 3 years, Dr. Patel would be there on the morning walks having these discussions. And after Prabhupada departed, the same Dr. Patel wrote an article for Bhakti Charu magazine about this morning walks, dozens and dozens and dozens of morning walks on the soft sand of Juhu Beach. And he called this article in Bhakti Charu my life's most precious moments. My life's most precious moments. Because he was so moved by Prabhupada's conviction in Krishna consciousness and by his knowledge of the scripture and how his arguments really defeated Dr. Patel's Mayavad understanding. There were also some light moments on the beach. It wasn't all arguments. There were also some light exchanges. When the devotees became too upset by the arguing between Dr. Patel and Srila Prabhupada asked them to read Krishna book as we walked. And when we did that, Dr. Patel wouldn't come. He wouldn't join us. He would walk separately, because he preferred the dialogue discussions. Prabhupada taking darshan, the deities and Juhu. It was very simple Vyasa-san. It was here in Juhu that Srila Prabhupada introduced what we do every morning now, the Guru Puja. This wonderful song by Srila Narottam Das Thakur. And it's very profound. If you look at the words in this song, especially there's a line, Guru Mukha Padmavakya Chitete Kariya Aita. This gives us also, we can go back to this Prakat and Apakala. Guru Mukha Padmavakya, the words coming from the lotus mouth of my spiritual master. Let them become one with my consciousness. Let my consciousness and those words become one. In other words, the mission of the spiritual master and of my mission. The words of the spiritual master are taken to my heart. Prabhupada writes that in the absence of the spiritual master, his words of instruction are the pride of the disciple, which is expressed in so many words by Narottam Das Thakur in this song. And then it goes, Arna Horyomane Asa. Except for this, except for making my consciousness one with the words of my spiritual master, there's no hope for me. I cannot hope to get closer to Krishna, get closer to the goal of my life, unless I'm unified in my consciousness with the desires of my Guru. So this is how to make the Guru the cut for us, to make him manifest. Take his instructions deep in our heart, not in a mechanical way. It's very much an internal journey. What does he want me to do now? How can I best apply whatever abilities I have, whatever intelligence I have? How can I best apply that now to please him? Because Krishna will be pleased in my life. This is one of the first Guru Pujas in Juhu, first in the world in Prabhupada's movement. This first temple in Juhu was just an open-air shed. It was open on three sides. In the afternoon, Prabhupada would have his massage on the roof trap in Juhu. He would speak to guests at that time, explaining to them what his movement was about. In the afternoon, he would go and have darshan on the roof. Very relaxed. He really enjoyed the atmosphere in the Sunday temple, Juhu temple. These little girls lived on the compound. It was on our property. They were tenants at that time, daughters of the tenants. And they did this little dance for Prabhupada on the roof. After the evening arti, Prabhupada would personally distribute Mahaprasadam to the guests and the children. And he remarked that even these wealthy people in Jubu, which was quite a wealthy suburb of Bombay, they would come for just a little bit of halva because he said they could appreciate the value of prasadam. It's not ordinary food, but it's the mercy of God placed in their hand. Such an exalted devotee of God. Many of the children, they would get a little bit in their hand and eat that and run to the back and come up for more. Prabhupada noticed that and he would wave his finger at them, but then he would give them seconds and even thirds. It's the cornerstone laying ceremony for the magnificent Jubu temple that's there today. It was done on March 22nd, 1872. So perhaps that's all we have time for today. I think it's been about an hour. Unless there's another question.
Hare Krishna, Mataji. Hare Krishna. Actually, there is some noise. My voice. Hare Krishna, Mataji. So there is one question. Mataji, like you mentioned, how important the experience of East Coast and Vrindavan was. Mataji, how we can give to others the same experience of Krishna consciousness, because sometimes only philosophy do not work.
Yes, it's true. It's not philosophy alone that convinces people. Philosophy is certainly part of it, but the experience, the touching of the heart is so important. So that can be done certainly through kirtan, certainly through heartfelt association. Sadhu Sangha is so important. It can really affect people's hearts when they know that we care about them, not just spiritually, but also materially. We sincerely care about them, and that we have something so valuable to give them, the knowledge, but also the process of understanding the knowledge. And then by and by, it's so important also to go to the Dham, high important Dham. Prabhupada wanted us to go there regularly to become rejuvenated spiritually. So all these experiences together will make wonderful, wonderful Vaishnavas out of us all. Oh, praying for them. In my case.
Hare Krishna. So this was the one question, Mataji. So we are very thankful for your most auspicious association. You shared your various experiences with Srila Prabhupada, that how your service with Srila Prabhupada started as a photojournalist and it continued throughout. And how you got first instruction from Srila Prabhupada, like when you wanted to go for some photography outside, Prabhupada said that you only will get cheated by others. So better stay at Vrindavan. And you narrated the pastime of Srila Prabhupada looking toward moon and telling tomorrow is the Ekadashi. And you told that how Srila Prabhupada, you were so much impressed by the logical presentation of Srila Prabhupada about Krishna consciousness. And you narrated the pastime of Srila Prabhupada speaking on the disappearance day of Bhakti Siddhanta Thakur, about how this appears and disappears. Similarly, the Krishna is always is in Vrindavan. He never leaves. And you also shared how Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur had a desire to preach to English speaking, and therefore Srila Prabhupada made it as his only purpose. So if we want to continue our spiritual life, we should take one of the instruction of our spiritual master and should dedicate our life for that purpose. And you shared various memories from your photography, and you took us back to the 1970s, meeting with the different devotees and traveling with Srila Prabhupada. So We are very thankful for your auspicious association. I forgot to mention in the beginning that Mataji is the temple president of Bhaktivedanta Manor, London, and so Mataji, we beg for your blessings to empower all of us to follow the teachings and become the loyal servant of Srila Prabhupada and continue our little services in ISKCON whole life. And we request you to kindly visit Ujjain sometime. And we ask forgiveness also, like in between there was some disturbance, some noise was coming. We were not able to hear, and there was some little disturbance. So thank you, Mataji, for your association. We uh, express our heartful gratitude by chanting one time Hare Krishna Mahamantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Her Grace Vishakha Mataji ki Jai, Jagat Krishna Prabhupada ki Jai.
Srila Prabhupada. Jai Bhakti Charu Swami. Thank you so much for inviting me. Very nice to have your association.
Hare Krishna.
Srila Prabhupada. Hare